Atlantis. Around this time, in the later days of Lemuria, you had another growing civilization on the other side of the world that you know of as Atlantis. It was also a melting pot of various different species. But rather than the Lemurian ideology of getting back to source and the spiritual pursuits, the Atlantean ideology was basically the same as the Lyran: technological development, expansion out into space, and conquest. This expansiveness is not necessarily negative when it is done from a place of balance. For a while, Atlantis was in balance because it did produce some very wonderful technologies that were very healing and beneficial to the people. But it began to be tainted once the Orion migration started. When we say the Orion migration, we are referring to what was mentioned earlier. Some of the priests would open holes in the Orion net, go through them, and come to Earth. They would come to Atlantis because it was more familiar to them. The Empire would pursue them through the net into Atlantis, and the whole dynamic was created over again. You can see the polarity dynamic being set up again. We do not have to tell you what happened with Atlantis because you know the story. It basically tore itself apart because of the battle of polarities. It also tore apart Lemuria for the most part. Once Atlantis expanded to its capacity, it wanted to obtain other islands. Lemuria fell very easily because it wasn't focused on war. The fall of Atlantis and Lemuria all occurred during a period of time when there was a tremendous amount of Earth change, what you might call a polar shift. So this actually facilitated the ending of those eras. But there were still areas on Earth engaging in genetic experiments to create the perfect human. Now get ready for some convolution of time and space, more so than we've already given you. Some of the founders, or the architects, who were watching over this experiment began to see that this wasn't going to work. They began to run a future projection, much like one would run a mathematical projection. They saw that Earth was not going to survive. They felt they must do something to change a variable that would set the Earth on another path. They made a radical decision. The Zeta Reticuli. From the founders' level of consciousness, it is no big deal to move through time. They connected with future probabilities to find a species that could give them some guidance. They found the species you now know as the Zeta Reticuli, or the Greys, as some of you call them. These beings exist in a one-mind culture. For those of you Star Trek fans, they are kind of like the Borg, but without all the negative manifestations. They are a simple, one-minded, unified field consciousness in many bodies. Forget what you think you know about the Zetas. We're not talking about what you read in the fear-producing literature. The Zetas lent some DNA to the founders and said, use this DNA. Go back and create a new timeline for Earth. Do this by creating a new Earth species. Up until this point, around the time of Lemuria and Atlantis, the only species that were really interacting on Earth were the Lyrans, who were somewhat more Caucasian, and the Vegans, who were somewhat more darker-skinned. Even in the genetic experiments using the primate DNA, they were modeling these new beings in their own image. They weren't so much making a new species as they were making copies of themselves. The Zeta said, no, you must make a new species. Here's how to do it. And the reason you need to do it is because the variable of unified mind must be instilled into the mass conscious of Earth, or it will not survive. The role of Asia. So the founders went back into the continent of Asia and began working on a new genetic project using the DNA from the Zeta Reticuli to create what is now the Asian race. We know this is somewhat out there, but right now on your planet, you have East and West. If you look at the ideologies of the two, there are some very strong polarities. Now, in this time frame on Earth, you are finding that the East and West are beginning to meet and blend. Given the opportunity to do so, what the founders felt was that this would calm the individualistic nature of the planet and eventually begin to teach all beings to live from the point of view of a group mind. We don't mean being group mind like a bunch of zombies. This would simply enable you to live within unity and diversity simultaneously. And there's the paradox. These genetic experiments in Asia were very protected and well guarded. Pretty soon they had prototypes of what you now call an Asian race. They scattered them throughout Asia. This is something that myself, Germain, and Sasha, a Pleiadian, have discussed with groups in Japan a lot. We have taken groups in Japan to some of the sites where the prototypes were kept and educated. Some of this information is available on tape. These Asian prototypes were the turning point in setting your world on its course toward integration. Once the genetic bodies were created and began procreating, some of the key prototypes were kept in educational facilities. They were educated in Vegan mysticism and also in some Pleiadian spiritual practices that are very feminine in nature. The Asian culture was ideologically influenced by an underlying Arcturian energy, but also by Vegan mysticism and Pleiadian spirituality. The prototypes were taught about consciousness, unified fields, and the mind-body connection. They were taught that the human was a holistic unit rather than a collection of organ, skin, and bone. They felt that these Asian prototypes had to be taught this immediately before they were imprinted with other belief systems that would be passed genetically into their offspring. This was very intense training in Vegan mysticism. Once the prototypes graduated, and there was indeed a graduation vision, quest, and ceremony, they were then allowed to go out, reproduce, and seed the whole area of Asia and some parts of Polynesia and Indonesia. In a sense, this was done under the nose of the rest of the planet. The other cultures were so absorbed with their own prototype projects, they didn't pay much attention and didn't think it would be much of a success anyway. Pretty soon the Vegan teaching, as carried in these early Asian prototypes, began to spread and affect the tapestry of the mass conscious itself, literally changing the course of Earth's journey. We cannot really stress this enough. If it wasn't for those Zetas and the founders who brought back the DNA and implemented this, we don't think you would have made it this far. There would have been too much individualism and polarity. Now you can see why there is such a difference between the teachings of the East and the teachings of the West, though there is indeed some parallel connection between them. There has always been a feeling in the belief system of the West that the East has been hiding something, or that they have some great secrets there. That is true, there are. It isn't just in the wisdom taught to the Asian prototypes. Remember that the Arcturian founders who went underground are still there. They are still the caretakers. They are the beings you refer to now as the Inner Earth beings. They are very old. They have been there a long time. During the destruction of Atlantis, there were some very powerful and positive priests in Atlantis, and others from all over the world who needed to go underground to preserve the knowledge they had gained thus far in the planet. It was these Inner Earth beings, that Arcturian beings, who housed themselves and made sure they were all right. Even in this time now, they still hold some of the most sacred teachings on Earth. These have not yet been given to the public freely, because of what would happen if they were. They are still caretaking this, so you have some very powerful guardians who are looking out for you and the best interests of the planet. They are not going anywhere because they take their commitment very seriously. The Zeta Reticuli beginnings. Let's go back in time. We are talking about the Vegans and their early development. There was a group of Vegans who split off from one of the groups and developed their own colonies in their own planetary system. Over time, they found themselves falling in line with the Lyran ideology. They somehow took a turn and began to become very technologically focused. They lost their connection to their planet and the memories of where they came from. They turned to science and technology for their solace, feeling that they could control their universe. Eventually, they polluted their planet, which polluted their people, who became very ill. They let their passions rule and destroy them. They eventually had a civilization on the brink of destruction. Most of the females and males could not reproduce due to the poison they had taken into their bodies, among other reasons. They knew that they had to do something very dramatic or they wouldn't make it. So what did they do? They realized their emotions were at the root of their situation. They took all that they had learned about genetic engineering and they said, "We're going to engineer ourselves to live without emotion. That will solve the problem." And they did this. They began repopulating themselves through the laboratory. Of course, they did not get any less toxic. It did not help their planet, which got so bad that they had to live underground. They continued with the genetic tinkering. They no longer had emotional bodies and, of course, became very imbalanced. Thousands of years went by and they realized they needed help. They had taken a wrong turn. They had done the wrong thing to heal themselves. They were at a total loss at how to repair the damage. We are making this story very brief. There are longer versions in the book, Visitors from Within. Eventually it came down to finding another source of genetic material in order to survive. They wanted to make the journey back to Source and thought they had the answer of how to get back, but it wasn't the answer. Their answer was to find another species with which they had a connection, a species that would volunteer to help them reclaim what they had lost so they could get back onto the path of reintegration with Source. And guess who volunteered? Earth humans. These beings who were in trouble are called the Zeta Reticuli, or Greys. Again, forget everything you've read that is fear-based. That doesn't come into the story. Some of the information is disinformation and convolution. Think only of the story we are telling you instead. What did the Zetas give in return for this assistant? Well, one thing they gave, as we stated earlier, was some of the genetic material along with the guidance about one-mindedness that helped to create the Asian race and ultimately save Earth. Another thing is that through the interaction of two species, that in some ways are very much of the opposite ends of the spectrum, each species can learn about fear and love. A human can look at a Zeta, and a Zeta can look at a human. Each can see its opposite self and walk through that fear. The Zetas can learn about individuality. Humans can also learn about unification. Both will be served. In addition, some very generous Earth beings offered their own DNA to help create a new species that is a cross between Zeta and human. Again, this sounds like an old story. Here we go again with another new species. Is this one going to make it? But this species, a combination of you and them, has a great promise of survival, not just because of the genetic tinkering, but because of the intent behind it. This intent is not to make the perfect human, just like everyone else wanted to do. The intent is to face the shadow, the opposite self, to love it, embrace it, and become it, therefore paving the path to reintegration into Source. You have all had these dramas going on simultaneously. It is enough to give you a headache. There is really no need to worry about any one of them. Just know that all of this is going on simultaneously. It is a grand dance, like a choreographed ballet. And even though at times it may seem perilous, we are certain that eventually the outcome will be reintegration. You were talking about how the Vegans ended up destroying themselves by engineering themselves to have no emotion. But then you started talking about the Zetas. What is the relationship between them? The vegan culture was a genetic source of the Zetas. In this presentation, we have shown how different species migrated and became other species throughout time. An offshoot of the Vegans eventually became the Zetas. What is left to the Vegans? There aren't many Vegans left in their original form. There are many cultures that are remnants of Vega, like Altair, for instance. However, the identity of Vegans as it existed millennia ago does not exist in the same way now. It is more that the Vegan ideology still exists as it is embodied within other cultures now. Do Arcturians live underground at Mount Shasta? Yes, regarding the Arcturian founders who have taken bodily form, we need to make clear that there are other star founders on the planet who have also served as caretakers. We chose to use Arcturus because they are a major influence. What was Christ's influence? Oh boy, this leads us into another messy area. He had a strong Arcturian influence balance. Throughout time, the powers that be, those running the genetic projects, always tried to create the perfect being. In the case of Christ and other well-known entities on your world, there was an attempt at joining what might be called two royal houses. As you know, an alliance is formed when you join two royal houses, and it is hoped that both can benefit from the joining. Christ represented a genetic cross. At the time of Christ, the royal houses were no longer Lyra and Vega. It was Lyra and Sirius. The Vegans, who were connected directly to Earth, had migrated to Sirius and then identified themselves as Syrians. At that point, the Syrians were the real genetic engineers, and they were very adept. Christ was an attempt at joining two royal star houses in the hope that peace could be brought. There was also an attempt to create the perfect human being. It was hoped that Christ would reproduce and insert a cross of genetics into the gene pool on Earth. He did reproduce, and his descendants became the Merovingian line. You find their trail in history throughout Europe. Remember that it was rumored Princess Diana was of Merovingian blood. Thus her child, who would be king someday, would also be Merovingian. Even in Japan, there is a place called the Grave of Christ. It is believed that Christ came to this village in northern Japan after his so-called crucifixion. He settled here, had a family, and eventually died. So Christ's genetics are indeed in the gene pool of your planet. Anything in the gene pool is in the grid of mass consciousness, unless a part of you as well. If there is one mutation in the gene pool on Earth, the entire gene pool will change due to the holographic principle. Is that how the genetic engineers seeded Earth? Partially. At the very beginning, they were all working on individual projects. The genetic engineering in Africa led to the creation of the African races. Genetic engineering in Asia led to the Asian races, of course. In the Americas, it led to the Native American races. Genetic engineering in Europe led to the Caucasian races, and so on. At first, they were all individual projects, but eventually there started to be crossbreeding. The changes began happening not just on the surface, but within the mass conscious as well. Even right now, as an example, if you suddenly took all the blacks and brought them to Africa, and all the Asians and brought them to Asia, separating people by region, those lines of separations wouldn't work. You are already changed as a whole. You can be separated by artificial boundaries, but it doesn't matter because your identity is as one people. You have to learn to live together. When you all learn to coexist in peace, you are really only making peace with other aspects of yourself. Can you talk about the capstone on the pyramid? I heard it is connected to Venus, Sirius, and Orion energy. First of all, Venus is a gate for Sirius energy as well as Pleiadian energy. Venus is probably one of the primary gates in your solar system for galactic energy. Regarding Egypt, because you are aware of some of the work of scientists who have researched the pyramids on the Giza Plateau and other temples, these pyramids are exact scale replicas of the Orion constellation. Most of you know that the pyramids are certainly much older than archaeologists are saying they are. When these temples were set up in the pattern of Orion, it was a reminder to anyone coming to this planet and to yourselves that the main theme you are working on in this integration of polarity. It also reminds you that the main star connection you are healing is Orion. When we spoke about the Orion net, we talked about how the priests would migrate and come to Earth. Some of the Orion gates they pass through on Earth are in the Middle East. Thus, it is no coincidence that Orion is the whole theme over Egypt. Osiris had a huge Orion connection. The precursors to the Egyptian gods, the Sumerians, had huge Orion, Sirius, and Lyra connections as well. There are other places on Earth where pyramid configurations mirror the Orion constellations. In the southwest, the city of Phoenix has it too, but those temples are so ancient that the remnants are under the city at this point. There are other areas in the southwestern United States. Areas in Mongolia are connected to Orion as well. The Orion energy has basically been stamped on this planet. That is what you cannot escape from. You have to heal this. This is a reminder that you are not going anywhere until those wounds are healed. So the Orion thing is what we see it to be. One thing I learned from this session is that it is helpful, and it is in us to be healed. We can look at this differently. It doesn't have to have an outcast energy. We don't have to get rid of it. I need to just transmute all this fear about Orion into love. Yes, we'll tell you a secret. Sometimes people have asked us, Germain, if you could categorize your energy, what would it be? The best way we can describe our matrix of consciousness is that we would call ourselves the Orion light. This does not mean polarized light, the opposite of dark. If you were to take the entire Orion drama and the way it played out even on the worlds, entirely integrated and healed, it would be the Orion light. That is all of you as well. You are this. We are not that scary, we hope. Germain, is there any way for you to give us a glimpse of what we look like to you? What do we really look like? We see you with 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, but as light beings who are just moving in fluid light. Your head is not round, but more oval. That is how we see you. We don't really see you as individuals. We can see that there are different beings in the room. We don't see your individual differences per se, but you feel different to us. That is the best way to describe it. Sorry for being so vague. Just to clarify, you are saying that right now on Earth there aren't beings who are specifically Vegan, Orion, or Lyran, right? Are you saying that we all have become sort of one species holographically? We are one species now. We are Earth humans, and each one of us has all this inside of us. Maybe someone has more Lyra than Vega, but we are truly Earthlings. Yes, absolutely. There are still Pleiadians, Arcturians, Sirians, and so forth out there. On your world, however, you have literally created a new species of unification from your galactic family. Initially, genetic crossbreeding is important because of a need to change these gene pools, but continued crossbreeding is not important. You could stop crossbreeding now because you have already set this species integration in motion. Well, the human genome right now is very uniform. You can't look at it and see any differences except for the specific orientation of the amino acids. But human beings are human beings. Yes, in the past, such as during the genetic projects, if you were to examine these new humans in Africa, Europe, and Asia, they would seem as if they were different species, though closely related. It is not that way anymore. How does Egypt carry our memories as a planet, and how do Atlantis and Lemuria fit into it? Most of the Egyptian gods and most of the Egyptian myth, for instances, the story of Osiris and Isis, are actually Egyptian versions of the memories of an older culture. What you know of the Egyptian mythology is actually closer to Mesopotamia, Babylon, Sumeria, and even earlier cultures. That is where these myths were created. They were passed through the generations through different civilizations, and each civilization adapted them as their own. So this idea of Osiris being chopped up is a metaphor, but it has its root in an older culture. Even the being Kuan Yin has parallels with Inanna, Isis, and so on. You have been carrying the same myth and repackaging them depending on the culture. This has kept your memory alive. A lot of these memories come from even more ancient times, those of Atlantis and Lemuria. There are much more ancient cultures that are the source or root of many of these myths, and for the newer civilizations like ancient Greece that have their own myth, many of their dramas adhere to the archetypes placed out into the earlier civilizations. Can you talk about Nibiru? Not much about this time, but the writings that you all have talked about, Nibiru being in an elliptical orbit that comes through your solar system every 3,600 years. We would agree with that, but we would expand on it and say that the planet Nibiru is also part of the Sirius system, though maybe part of your solar system for a temporary period of time. You and the Sirius system are very strongly connected. If you were out in Lyra and somewhere else in space, looking in your telescope towards this part of the galaxy, you would most likely think that Sirius, Earth's sun, and Vega are part of the same constellation or even system. From your perspective, Vega is in the Lyran system. But from somewhere else out in space, it would look more like it is a part of your system because it is so close. Yes, Sirius is about 8 light years from Earth, and Vega is about 14. So from space, it might look like 3 stars close together. And also, can I ask a question about Mars and what is now the asteroid belt, Maldek? You said that there was a planet there, and there remains a former colonization activity on Mars. Can we discover it when we go there? Yes, some of it has already been discovered. As for the asteroid belt, there were several different things that caused the destruction of that planet. One was that the society living there was degenerating, lots of war. There was an external cataclysm or impact, and there was also some punishment. There was a skirmish, and someone out there felt that Maldek was expendable. It was helped along in its own destruction. We know that some of this information on Earth was pulled from Tiamat, another planetary body. Earth is younger than some of the other planets like Mars. It was formed later by a cataclysm. When the solar system was first created, there were only 4 large planets. Fragmentation occurred through various events, creating even more planets, and this is very natural. Are we correct in thinking that the beings were first on Maldek, then Mars, and from there they migrated on Earth? Well, Maldek and Mars were originally colonized by the Vegans in very ancient days. For a period of time, there was simultaneously colonization of both. I heard that there are some Pleiadians and Orion still living on Mars and controlling Earth's events. Is this true? Not to the extent that the rumors would like you to think. There is definitely an influence surrounding Mars. We're not really been allowed to talk about this. We don't mean that someone isn't allowing it. It is more than that, from a bird's-eye perspective. We can sense what serves you and what doesn't. There is a faction that believes it's owned Mars, and there have been some incidents like Phobos, the Earth probe that was destroyed when it went to Mars, that resulted from the groups believing they own Mars. Right now, Mars is in dispute. When humans developing rudimentary space travel, Earth is becoming another faction that must be dealt with. So in the know in your government understand that something is going on, and they are not pushing expedition to Mars at this time. So in numbers, are you talking 1,000 or less? Less. Are they physically incarnated there? Not incarnated in terms of born there. It is more like being temporarily housed there in physical bodies, but not what you know to be third-dimensional. They are a slightly different frequency. Realities might not align between the two of you, but you can still influence each other energetically. Are they negatives, and are they the influencers on Earth? It is not our perspective to ever label anyone negative. That is a polarity. The very thing we are attempting to communicate with you today is that it is a lot different than that. We will not confirm that, but what we will say is that there are always attempts by various groups to exert their influence. There is a group associated with Mars attempting to influence and control. Whether this makes them negative is a value judgment that we cannot make. Each of you often tries to exert your control on others too. That doesn't mean you are negative either. What about the face on Mars? Is it really a face? It performs the same function as the overlay of Orion in the Giza Plateau. It is a reminder. Just like any good Rorschach test, what you see is what you need to see. Can you tell us how many planets are populated? Maybe not just in our dimension, but how many are populated in some way throughout all dimensions? Populated. You would have to define populated. Dense and physical beings. With a few exemptions, just about every planet has consciousness associated with it. Remember what we said at the very beginning. The planets and the stars are the founders. For example, in the case of the Palladian planet that was destroyed and left there as a reminder, there is no consciousness associated with it, and that was deliberate. Those who see it can really feel the deadness and folly of war. Most have consciousness associated with them. Some have had more individualized consciousness, like Earth. Planets like Neptune have much more non-physical consciousness associated with them. It really depends on the planet. What about the Moon? To some degree, and you might find this answer shocking, the Moon has very little consciousness associated with it. But let us explain. In civilizations that have trouble getting in touch with and validating their own darkness, people need symbols to remind them. The Moon has always been associated with the esoteric, going within and making spiritual journey. In females, you have the moon time, a time when you go within. When you are out in the desert or forest communing with the moon and doing sacred work, you are going within. We do not mean to imply the moon is barren and has no consciousness. The consciousness associated with the moon is not meant to give you something, but to remind you of something. Like the tide, it can help pull the darkness out of you. The moon has cycles where it is visible and not visible that connect it with the tides. It is literally responsible not just for the tidal flow, but for providing an energetic flow for each of you to feel your power. You feel this power in a masculine way when the moon is full and waxing, and you feel your feminine power when the moon is waning. This provides the frequency to remind you the flow of the universe. Its purpose is not like the founder associated with Venus. It is very difficult. It is for a very specific purpose that helps each of you maintain your connection. What about the founder that is associated with our sun, Sol? He is so often overlooked. He has to have a great sense of humor. I will have a conversation with him in just a moment. He says that his consciousness piggybacked on the founder who first manifested in the Lyran system as one of the first suns. When we say piggybacked, we mean he didn't actively participate, but was there in energy. He also piggybacked on the sons of several civilizations of Vega before Sol was born. The reason for this was that Sol needed to watch the very beginning of humanoid life, so that when he became his own son, he would have wisdom to help guide you through the integration of polarity. He wanted to see your beginnings. From the very beginning, he knew he would eventually be the son Sol, who would create the solar system that would help the integration of the whole galactic family. Even though the sun is not as old as others in this incarnation, he has much experience and wisdom behind him. I have a few questions about religion or spirituality. The desire for these ancient ET civilizations has been to return to source. In the Eastern tradition, there are practices that help people return to that consciousness and experience themselves as infinite and eternal. But the return to source is really done in consciousness, not in physical experience. That is available to all of us at any time. Yes, the challenge has been the distraction of physicality. Obviously, when you accomplish something through great challenges, that's when you really learn it. The belief has been to take yourself far away from the thing in order to know the thing. Therein lies the paradox. So yes, it is really up to you. If any of you could truly know the true consciousness and know how to put that knowingness into practice while totally ignoring the distractions, you could probably ascend immediately. There'd be no reason to be here. The irony is that the more you may want to ascend, the more you actually have to stay. When you love being here and you roll on the earth and you are fully here, you go. Is it possible to maintain that connection and always know my true self, yet stay here and play? Yes, of course. Everything is possible. End of chapter. Epilogue. This state of remembering your true selves, or our infinite awareness, has been a quest of spiritual seekers since before recorded history. Our extraterrestrial forefathers are no exception. Through their journey away from source and into the distraction of physical reality and all of its drama, they often forgot their true nature's infinite consciousness. But somehow their inner drives to reunify and break the illusion of the temporary experience of physical reality kept them moving forward, with integration as the eventual result. Today, we are our forefathers. We forge ahead into the unknown with a nagging emptiness that keeps us searching beyond religion and New Age exploration into a deeper place of authenticity and knowingness. In this still, silent place, we learn to differentiate between the distractions, opinions, and dramas of the ego, including the seduction of illusory physical reality, and the realm of paradoxical emptiness and fullness in which our true awareness abides. Through the authentic practices of esoteric spirituality on earth, which was very much influenced by Vegan mysticism, the ancients created many roadmaps that point the way home. They have been left to us as the most valuable of gifts. One of the most profound Vedic roadmaps, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, point out the last of the challenges in our awakening, our ability to differentiate between what is truly real and what is not. This simplified interpretation of two sutras makes this challenge clear. 11:17. The cause of our suffering is our inability to differentiate between what is the truth, the one who perceives, that is, the eternal awareness, and what appears to be the truth, the one that is perceived by eternal awareness, that is, the human mind. 11:23. The inability to differentiate between the temporary, fluctuating mind and our true self, eternal awareness, is the cause of our suffering. Yet this suffering provides us with the opportunity to learn differentiation and grow from it by understanding the true nature of both mind and eternal awareness. As awareness grows on Earth, which is happening at a very rapid rate, we facilitate the reunification not only of our galactic family, but with Source itself, as our extraterrestrial forefathers intended. One step at a time, with open hearts and minds, we take this journey together. End of chapter. End of book.